I'm Alex.
Hey, I'm Parv, and this
Is trying to product.
we're two Silicon Valley product managers, and we know how messy it can be.
So we're here to talk about the ups and downs of being a PM. It's not always straightforward, but we're here to figure it out together.
Hey, Alex.
Hey, Parv. It's been a while.
I know. How's it been?
I get no complaints. It's been a good year in product.
Good year in product. How's the new gig? You're now doing like all this product consulting kind of world, right?
Yeah, so I left big tech and now I'm doing my own kind of product consultancy, helping businesses make new products in new areas, do the research, and then ultimately make a new product from 0 to 1.
How's that transition been? Like, I'm so curious. Like, you went from working in a controlled environment where you had most resourcing sorted out. Well, of course, you have to still fight for resources, but in that situation, moving to like, I'm just so curious, like, how does that world work? Because you're like the only PM, you may be the only employee. Like, how is that?
Yeah, I think it's kind of refreshing. I think because a lot of times you're actually working just directly with the founder or the kind of founding team. So it's a lot less of like, a lot of the politics that goes on in big tech, people vying for promotions. You have all these kind of different factions who have all their different needs. It's like ends up being a lot more complicated in like a big company. But in the consultancy role, at least like how I'm kind of brought on typically is at the very beginning of a product. So like someone has some goal, they want to build this app, they want to build an AI feature, they want to do this, but they don't know enough about that area specifically.
Huh?
So you kind of come in as both a subject matter expert and someone who knows how to take a product from 0 to 1. And so you're just trying to solve the problem, understand the customers, and essentially make the right product decisions for the long term, which is like kind of the essence of product, right? It's the fun part, at least for me. And so in big tech, yes, you get to build stuff, and you get to touch literally billions of people, and that's really rewarding in its own way. It's not really that core of
Yeah,
product. Everything moves slower. You got to deal with the politics. You got to play the games. You got to do all of that kind of stuff. And I wanted to take a step back from that. I wanted to really, do what I love, which is building stuff and
nice.
making the right product for the right customers. So I think that was really refreshing, being able to kind of take that leap and do this.
Nice. How much of it is like focused on what the founder is trying to do and what the founder wants versus you coming in and leading the product? Is it more just responding to whatever they want and doing the specs, or is it like, oh, I'm going to come in and I'm going to define everything, I'm going to help the founder like find PMF or figure out what we need to build? Like, is it, or do you have like everyone is a different stage?
Oh, yeah, I think that's a great question. I think everyone's at a different stage. I think for the most part, when I come in with like just a single founder or a small founding
Uh-huh.
team, it's really like, hey, we want to build this thing. Is this the right thing to build? And so then it goes from like say for example, you want to make a small app that
Huh?
like uses AI video or something like that. So then it's not a question of do we just go and build that? Like we get the developers, we get the designers, we just start building that. No. Normally it's like, okay, I'm gonna go talk to a bunch of people and see what their problems are in this area. So for instance, if you're a client, you want to make an AI video app. Okay, great. Who do you think your customers are? And then I'll go use like userinterviews.com or one of these
Yeah.
websites, try to source potential customers in this
Mhm.
area. And I'll just talk to them and be like, hey, like, what are the problems that you guys face?
Yep.
Like, what would you like in the software that you use? What software do you
Hmm.
use? And then from there, I'll normally build a survey. And that survey essentially is like, hey, what are your main pain points? And how would you categorize that? So like, it's really the essence of a product of like making sure you're actually building a product that customers need. And then going back to the founders and be like, hey, here's what the data says. Here's what the survey said. Here's what the takeaways from the interviews were. Maybe the right product is not actually like an AI video app. Maybe it's like a collaborative video editing app because that seems to be the number one problem that this customer segment is facing. And then they a lot of times are pretty receptive to it. And normally you find a lot of different stuff, like a lot of different problems that maybe aren't really necessarily like they're not necessarily solved in a good way.
Yeah.
And often you'll hear that you're like, hey, I use like Premiere and Premiere doesn't do this,
Yeah.
or I use like all of these apps
Hmm.
and there's like some shortcoming. So then you can do the competitor analysis and see like could you build something in a space, and is that space big enough? Because you now have the data, like, this is a big problem. This problem, I would rate this as like my number one problem as a video editor, for instance.
Yeah.
And so then you can go and attack that problem, like really from like kind of first principles, ground up, like who is it, like what does this customer need? You talk to the customer, you keep kind of going back and forth, and you work with the co-founder to make sure that they like this kind of potential route. And normally they're, depending on where they are, who gave them funding, like it kind of depends, but a lot of times they're receptive to routes in the similar area. So if you started out with AI video editing, you still got to put AI in there for the investors, but now it's like AI collaborative video editing or something like that. So I think that's kind of, it's a lot more fun, at least for me. I guess it's really trying to do the research, do the right research, talk to the right people, a lot of conversations with potential users, and then going from 0 to 1 on a product, on an app or whatever it might be.
Does it feel nice to not have the constraints that you have at a big tech company for all of these kind of things?
Yeah, I think this is like a personality thing. I think for a lot of folks is like at big tech, you literally have like a dedicated team to almost anything that you want. Like for instance, like I'm talking about user interviews and user surveys. There's normally a user research team that you go talk to, and they go do this stuff for you, and they come back with the research. Or there's a data analytics team, and like they'll do the data analytics on like a website or whatever, and like they'll come back with that information. So if you kind of aren't really necessarily interested in like, doing user interviews and doing like data analytics and like all of this stuff, big tech is great because like you can really focus on your specialty. But if you kind of like everything and you're really a generalist, which is kind of where I sit, love actually doing like all of this stuff. I love designing. I love doing the analytics. I love like talking to actual users. Like that's like my favorite part of building a product. So it works out nicely to be able to kind of do this end to end as opposed to relying on all these teams. Um, Especially I guess with this user interview part, like it's really just a conversation, right? Like how can you outsource a conversation? Right? I feel like that's something that like as a PM, like you're always going to notice things that a user researcher is not necessarily going to kind of pursue in a conversation just because they don't have the same context that you have. So when you're talking to someone about like some problem, you can really hammer and go much deeper in that specific area and learn a lot more than you otherwise would from just kind of getting the results of a conversation. But in big tech, they also have a lot of privacy stuff. They don't really want you on a lot of these calls. It just ends up being a lot of headache to try to sit on all these calls with them and then text them on the side, hey, can you ask this question? Can you please ask this question? And then the hope that they can kind of like see that chat and finagle it into the conversation. So I think it really depends on the personality. For me, I love kind of end to end doing all of this kind of stuff, but you do have to have like some type of kind of baseline expertise in this area across many areas to be able to do this, I think, competently. Or you can always kind of rely on other people and hire them as subcontractors.
It does feel like it's not just a PM role, it's also a little bit, I mean, you do all of this as part of a PM role and you are supposed to be involved in all of this, but you get to flex more of these chops in this kind of product consultancy world, right? Like you can't just like walk away with like high level research, or you need to really dig into it. You need to be deep into that process. You need to be able to figure out stuff, which again we expect from each other as PMs, but we don't get to do it as much because you don't have to get your hands dirty in those kind of ways because you have like massive teams supporting that. But in this world that you're in, I mean, the entire roadmap technically can get derailed if you get the wrong insights. Um, so it's like high risk, high reward. But as you said, right, it's like also for someone, depending on the personality, is more fun. It's more like kind of the reason why, like I'm also like right now in a startup. So I was in big tech before. We were there together. Very different culture, different vibe. Now, of course, you know, has its own, and we'll talk about this later, has its own like charm and pros and cons. But I think, if you want to do, or if you're more like a builder kind of person and you like operating in that kind of model, I think startups and like a consultancy really gets you like that more builder vibe. And you have more people operating in these days, like everyone's most beautiful pet term in Silicon Valley, everyone's operating in founder mode. But that's fun. Interesting. I do have a question in general, and I want to ask. So, how would anyone who has been a PM think about transitioning into product consulting? Because, and we'll talk about this as well. The job market right now, it's a lot of people are trying to break into PM. A lot of people are trying to look for their next career move. And, when you're a product manager, there are a couple of different paths, but I know a lot of people who would really enjoy this kind of space, which is, you know, a single PM helping founders find PMF, build products, next level, 0 to 1, 1 to 100, but, not tied down in a specific company. So I am curious, are there any specific skills that you would say one needs to build while they're a PM at like a big tech company or a startup, or any type of experience that would help them transition into like this kind of world?
Honestly, I think all the skills that I've learned have been at startups. So I think
Okay.
this is where like the startup experience actually is like super critical because at a startup, especially I was at a seed stage. So seed stage was like, I think I was employee number 7 or 8.
Wow.
So you get like, I was the first PM. I was actually hired as a designer, and then they found out I was actually a PM. So I got promoted to PM within like a month or two. And so I was like the only PM. I was also in charge of design because that was what they hired me for. And then the marketing person left after month 3 that I was there, and then I got promoted to be in charge of marketing, design, and product. Um, so then basically in that role, I had to do everything I'm kind of doing now with like the consultancy. I had to design all the apps that they had. I had to design the customer experience, the packaging, all the marketing materials, social media ads. I had to plan out the marketing strategy, work with the agencies. So I ended up having to kind of do everything at that role, which makes me like a super generalist. Like I had to, you know, stand up like, multi $10,000 Facebook campaigns. I had to do YouTube ads, Pinterest ads, like experiment with all of these different marketing techniques and then figure out how to sell the product and how to go to market with new products. So like I think all this is incredibly important when you're going from 0 to 1, especially like distribution is everything, right? And so having worked at a startup, you really understand when you don't have product market fit, how important it is to find customers, how important it is to get distribution, to get eyeballs on your product, just to see if, people like just to start getting feedback more than anything else. So I think if you're going from big tech to kind of doing something like this, I think I don't want to say impossible, but very, very difficult unless you try to do your own startup on the side or try to kind of scale up kind of more slowly, maybe more specialized instead of trying to be like a 0 to 1 PM, try to maybe go more specific into whatever your domain is. So for instance, if you're like, I guess it's maybe like a technical PM on like a backend for some type of product, it might make more sense to try to be the same thing for a startup. It'd just be a consultant for like one problem that they have. Otherwise, you're probably going to want to have some type of founder experience because a founder is really the only other type of person who's going to have this kind of breadth of experience, like early, like seed stage, maybe Series A. But I can't speak to Series A. But you want to be essentially in some position where you've had to do a lot of stuff and go 0 to 1 multiple times. I love going 0 to 1, but like I always build products on my side, on the side, as you know, Parv. Like this is like making products is my favorite thing. Going like finding a problem, talking to customers, and then building it. That's what I do in my free time. Like that's my favorite part. So I think that was also kind of the background. I do this for fun, anyways. I think if you're at big tech and you don't want to do the whole startup thing because it is definitely a grind and a lot of late nights and a lot of work, as far as you know firsthand, then I think maybe trying to make your own product and trying to market it, trying to go through that whole thing, understanding that, worst case, I guess there's actually not really a worst case here. Like worst case, I was going to say it fails, but if it fails, you've now learned all the skills you need to go and do this on your own as a consultant for other companies who need this service. Best case, like now you have a product that's hopefully generating some revenue and you have a little bit more flexibility to kind of chart out what you want to do in life, and take only the clients you really want. I think honestly, that's like one of the biggest benefits. Like being able to fire clients is probably the single best quality of life improvement you can have. I've fired like quite a few clients at this point, not just because either their expectations didn't line up with the hours I was willing to put in or whatever it was. but being able to have that flexibility to only work with the people that you actually like working with is super important. If you have a product that succeeded to some degree, then you have a lot more flexibility. And I think that's kind of really what we're all kind of seeking. It's just flexibility, um, being able to work with the people you want to work with on the projects you want to work with. That's really like why I think consulting is maybe a lot better in some ways. You just have a lot more control over your life and your hours. Like right now, I don't have any clients because I'm you know hanging out with Parv in SF for a couple weeks, and then
Uh-huh.
I'm gonna go to Hawaii for a month. So
Yeah.
I kind of turn it on and off as I need.
I guess so that's interesting that, you say one of the better experiences to train you up for that kind of situation is like a startup or doing something on your own, which kind of makes sense, right? Like I don't want to say coddled at a big tech company, but you have enough support and resources that try and
I know. I
maybe,
think coddle is the right word. Like you have all these resources, and it's actually that like I got in trouble a lot of times because I would try not to use those resources, and then those teams, you
yeah,
know, they want to like do the data analytics, they
yeah,
want to do the
uh-huh,
design, they want to do all this stuff, but lose a level of control
okay.
by kind of outsourcing it to these teams who have less context than you do. Um, so, but it's highly discouraged to kind of go around people, and you should definitely work with your partners and make sure they have the context to do all of that stuff. But it does mean that you're not getting the skills that you would need to kind of do this on your own.
Yeah, okay, I see that. But in the product consulting world, like, is there ever, this famous Steve Jobs kind of video in which he talks about, when you're a consultant, one of the biggest things that you miss out on is like seeing the product through its life cycle, which is, you figure out the research, you build something, but then you're also sticking around in a product company, in a big company, with like the the results, the consequences of your work, like measuring, seeing the impact, iterating. And do you see this as a potential gap in your avenue so far with product consulting, where you're like, okay, I come in, I build, maybe I stick around for like the 1 month post launch, uh, but then I like F off and I have no insight into like, okay, how do I iterate? What do I need to like metrics? What am I missing? What didn't work? What worked? So is that something that you think is a muscle that you flex less of when you're in a consulting gig?
I think so. Mostly, I do apps and website like optimization and 0 to 1. So I think a lot of times when you're building an MVP, which is how almost all these things start, you kind of know what optimizations you're going to need in the long term. And so especially like a lot of times like the client they don't have that team yet, right? So they're just telling you like, okay, great, we have the app. It's now like we have an MVP, we have some users, they like bought some ads, they did the launch, and then I mean honestly, most times they don't get users. Like that's the reality. Marketing is incredibly difficult, especially B2C. So then mostly what they have to do there is start marketing, which is kind of where I kind of leave them. I'm like, hey, here's a marketing person, go work with them and try to get users. Once you get users, here's the things you have to try to optimize towards. Obviously, you're trying to get purchases. Here's maybe 3 tests to improve the purchase funnel in the app that we just made. So a lot of times it's pretty obvious based off of the metrics that they want. The issue is normally they're too early to have users. So then if they have users and they need you, then they call you back. But I think also that Steve Jobs thing is from like what, the 90s. It's like
Yeah, I think
relatively
he was also comparing, okay, but not the exact same situation, right? He was comparing working or
well. I
consultants to like working at a tech product
no,
company.
no, no, I think at that time he was right, but now everyone job hops so frequently that I think even right if you build a product in big tech, it normally takes around 2 years to build any new
Mhm.
feature, like 1 to 2 years. So by the time that feature is launched, you've probably bounced either internally or to another company. So even in
Interesting.
big tech, like my experience after building something is that the people I built it with mostly have shifted around so that they still don't own it. And the nice thing about like working with smaller companies is like you can build stuff like ridiculously fast from a big tech perspective, and you get to own a lot more than you actually do when you build a product for like 2 years, and then half the team goes on to do a different project, and they don't touch this project again, and it's shifted off to kind of the end of life team or a different team that has to then carry it on. I think maybe the culture has shifted, and now you don't really see that many people sticking with one project or one product for a longer period of time. And so I think he's right in the sense that consultants don't own it, but I think nowadays everyone is kind of in a consultant mindset.
That, it's a good point, but then that makes me wonder, honestly, if, yes, 0 to 1 is a different ball game and a different skill set, but I actually think 1 to 10 and 10 to 100 is also as difficult and or requires like its own level of like skills.
Oh yeah,
And
100%.
when you say that, it has been something that I've tried to keep in my career, is that, you know, yes, I've been involved in 0 to 1 products, but also really tried my best to stay around to actually try and take that from 1 to 10 or 10 to 100. And I think it's an invaluable skill, knowing what you build, measuring, and then iterating on that. Um, and I think in big tech, the point that you make is true. But then now I wonder, like, are they also missing out on a particular skill set around just like measurement and follow up? Because there's so many compromises that you make. There's an art to follow up. Like it's a different, way of product development also, and just makes me think, it's worth thinking about. And for others out there also, it's like, how do you see your career in terms of like follow up versus MVP and the different stages? But I mean, we've been talking about this for a while, so I think it makes sense to just, I do want to I know we've been personally had this debate and just conversation, but how do you see PM differently within big tech and startups? Like, there's just such a different world. Like, it's the same word, it's product management, but I feel like my experience in big tech versus a startup is so different that I sometimes am like dumbfounded when I realize it's literally the same role. But my work was sometimes in some different areas just like the complete opposite of what I did. Um, I have like, we've worked at both spots. I think it's a worthwhile conversation to have. Like, are there pros and cons? Would you recommend one over the other? I mean, I know your answer. I think you know my answer, but I think it's still worth talking about because I keep flipping between it. My take right now is startup, but I have started to see a lot of value in big tech product management. And I know there's like, a lot of stigma around it. But yeah, what are your thoughts? Like, I'll go later, but I have a lot of hopefully spicy takes. Actually, not hopefully.
I mean, yeah, I think to your point, there's definitely some pros. I think like one of the things I learned, at least from big tech product management, is kind of, I think maybe half the year is just planning. It's like resource planning. I don't know if that's really valuable. I think maybe it's more interesting, like how the planning happens, how the resource allocation happens between engineering, design, marketing, like all these different teams. Essentially, you have like the list of things that you want to build. You go and talk to all of the kind of your partners, make sure that everyone agrees on the list. You put the list on the Google sheet, and then basically fight with all the other PMs who want to build everything with all the weeks and everything, and then do a lot of negotiation. Like that was probably the bulk of the PM stuff at. I mean, you have a lot of partner with conversations. Of course, you have writing specs and all this stuff, but I think it really boils down to like the negotiations you do a couple times a year for the resource allocation, which is kind of interesting and I think a little bit maybe unique. Because at startups, you really don't have that level of robust planning, at least in like seed stage where I was. It's kind of like, oh, like what's broken? What do we need? What's going to kill us first? It's kind of a much more kind of survivorship focused, product management. Whereas big tech, it's a lot of just negotiation, discussion,
Conversation, just a lot of conversations.
yeah, a lot of conversations. I think the trouble I think with big tech is I don't know how to apply that. Like I don't know how it's useful outside of big tech. I think it's negotiating and being able to sell is like an incredibly useful skill, and maybe that's the core thing you're learning. But outside of like, it's definitely helpful, to be able to sell, but you learn that also in startups. Maybe
Okay.
it's even more valuable
I'll
in startups.
let me counter argument to that point. When I transitioned from big tech to startup, I think one of the things that I took with myself, one thing slightly related to what you said is just the um like the art of getting buy-in. Like
Mm.
at a big tech company, you're involved in so many conversations around trying to get people to sort of buy into your product, the vision, the strategy, the roadmap. And I think there's just so much that you learn about that. Like, how do you communicate? How do you present? Like, different stakeholders have different needs. They look at things differently. Their psychology is different. Their biases are different. Their priorities are different. And so, how do you like take communication, take the data you want to share at a level that's applicable to all different things? Now, yes, you do that at a startup too, but at a startup, the goal and the incentives are slightly more aligned than big tech. And so everyone's partially bought into a vision from the get-go, and it also depends on the organizational context, how your C-level is set up, how priorities are set, but there is more shared alignment than at big tech. And I think that skill has been really helpful in just trying to figure out how do you negotiate, a, as you said, b, get buy-in from different stakeholders. The other thing that I realized is, when you work with specific SMEs, subject matter experts in different fields, I think there's a lot of nuance that you start to pick up that you, I mean, when you're at a startup, you get to do everything or you have to do everything sometimes, but then you're kind of not doing everything. Well, you can, but you are making compromises. But when I was working at Big Tech, there were so many things I walked out of there around, like legal, for example. Like I went in and there were so many legal constraints that I knew from the start that I need to build for or I could solve for. I understood like you know those kind of things that we will need to think about. Like, okay, is this part of our terms and service? Because I had to think about that. Like my legal counterpart had brought that up. So when we make this change, we need to make sure that it's going to be in our TOS and then it needs to go to the members so that they can accept it for this type of feature because this data is going to be being used in X, Y, and Z way, which yes, you get to learn at a startup, but sometimes the learning can be really costly. Whereas a big tech, you have so many SMEs that you start to pick up these nuances and these kind of like different stakeholder patterns into your product thinking as well. So I don't know, that's my kind of like version of saying, yeah, I did see skills that were transferable. And then scale. Sorry, like the last thing is scale. Like building for 1 million users makes you so much more ready to build for 1,000 or 10,000. I can't even state how many times it's happened where something's broken in production at a startup where I've been working, but I've also dealt with the same situation at a big tech company. My reaction and anxiety levels at big tech were very different. And having been through that there really prepped me for how to handle those situations when it happened at a startup. Like I had gone through such rigorous postmortems, RCAs, and processes around like protecting against those from happening, like, and then also how to mitigate and how to like manage that once it's happened. So I think that was also something that's really helped me prepped for like a startup.
I think it's also a scale thing. I think at the like a Series B, Series C startup, like you have a lot of these things that are pretty directly transferable. I think yeah, I was at seed stage. So like legal, if you have legal problems, that's like a good problem to have. Like that means you got like at a certain level that people actually are paying attention to you. So I think that's kind of maybe one of those things that is transferable at the like at the you know upper end of startups, the ones who've kind of raised more money or at least got more revenue and are much bigger. So I think those are definitely much more transferable. It just depends on kind of what startup or what scale the startup is at. Because at a certain point, a startup becomes big tech, right? So Facebook was a startup at one point. Now it's got a lot of organizational stuff, got a lot of legal folks. It's got a lot of all of these kind of teams to make sure that they don't make have too big of a mess up. Um, Depending on your stage of the startup, like eventually you're going to get there. It's just at the early stage, these are all like kind of good problems to have. If someone cares enough to like sue you, like it's good. So I think yeah, the transferableness level is really probably when your startup is on the larger end. But I think when you're seed stage, like the difference between seed stage and your own project is very minimal, right? Like the only difference
Okay.
is you have a little bit more VC funding, you have a little bit more runway, but then it depends on those founders. The founders that I was working with, super stingy, super stingy, impressively stingy. I think to their credit, because they were able to make like a relatively small seed round last for like 3 years and build like 2 hardware products, like very impressive. But that stinginess comes with a lot more kind of maybe creativeness on how to
Resourcefulness.
resourcefulness, yeah, on how to use the money. Um, finding folks in Philippines to do the customer support, training customer support people all over the world, like just trying to kind of stretch that dollar. But the difference between you doing your own project and the seed stage is in that case pretty transferable. It's kind of 1 to 1, which is I think nice if you want to build your own company.
Mm.
But if you're going into big tech, it's a dramatic difference. Like I remember when I went to big tech, they were literally like my boss was teaching me like how to use the calendar because I'd never used like a calendar before because literally all my meetings were ad hoc. I'd walk in, the founder would be like, "Hey, Alex, we got to talk," and then we'd have our meeting. So a lot of it is a little bit messier.
Don't know if you want that on public record that they taught you how to use a calendar, but
Yeah,
I'm going to keep it in this episode. I don't care. That's too funny.
yeah. I
No,
think
you're right. You're right. Okay.
yeah, I think a lot of things like are super like kind of just taken for granted. I think in big tech that people have, but at the startup, especially seed startup, you don't need a lot of that. So the transferable this level is relatively low, I think.
Yeah. Okay. I can see the point where you're probably comparing it to different stage startups, but you know, how many people are transitioning from big tech to seed stage? I assume that's a lower transfer rate
Yeah,
versus big tech to Series B, Series C, Series D,
yeah,
pre-IPO. Um, and so, I mean, going into seed stage, honestly, like, I don't think anything preps you for that in any way. Like,
yeah,
there's just a different level of skills that you need going into a seed stage
yeah,
company.
definitely.
But then on the flip side, like as you said, when you're at a seed stage company, I don't think you can also make the argument that says, oh, if I work there, I can do big tech easily. I think
Yeah. I think for me the transition was very difficult to go
exactly
from
because
seed stage to big
yeah,
tech. Yeah,
and and I think it's the other way around because you're in seed stages, like there's just no barrier. There's no one stopping you, or there's no one sort of like no political issues in the organization. The organizational alignment is so strong. There's just everyone wants to get shit done. So if there's something missing, you go ahead. You would pick up, open the Figma file, make the changes you want. Like probably don't even have a designer, so you're doing it all yourself. You go into analytics, start to set up analytics for your product, and but that's very different in big tech, right? Because when you move into big tech, it's such a large organization sometimes that it becomes way harder to get stuff done, which is a difficult transition, not that you're not prepared for. Because then you have to start to get buy-in, you have to start to get alignment, you have to start to get that shared vision. And I think that itself is such an impressive skill where you walk in and you can get like a team of 100 behind you to say, yes, let's do this. And so, you know, that's the one thing that I've noticed is like at a startup, I've had I've had to do buy-in conversations, I've had to convince stakeholders, but it's not been as much as I did at big tech. Deck after deck, presentation after presentation, like multiple gates with multiple stakeholders. I'm at a startup, it was like, hey, let's do this. Why? You present the data, you present the argument, mostly everyone is aligned. And if not, you have the conversation that you need to, but everyone's like willing to try stuff out, willing to like, go all the way. Whereas at big tech, like you have to build that muscle
Mhm.
of like trying to get that in.
No, I think definitely like my first 3 weeks in big tech, I told everybody that we could build all their projects, And then my boss finally found out and was like, Alex, we can't build any of this. Stop talking. It was like such a different thing, like from saying yes to everybody and just figuring out how to do it to like basically trying to figure out 1,000 ways to say no. I think was kind of to that kind of to your point of that transition is how to say no, how to like get buy-in, how to make people happy while also saying you're probably never going to do this, and then ultimately trying to shift strategy in the long term. I think it takes a lot of kind
Yeah.
of practice.
I do like enjoy that part of startups, which is just like, let's do this shit.
Yep.
Like getting into the weeds, being able to like work with your design, your engineering counterparts, just like that hashing stuff out quickly, figuring out what to do next. I really do enjoy that part, knock on wood. And yeah, I think, well, I mean, we've been talking about big tech and startups and just like the different product roles there. And I think you guys heard a bike behind us, but that's fine. Have we missed anything on that? Is there anything else like pros or cons between, or like just
Well, I guess like
pros? I think it's you get to see and you get to be part of and see the the sausage being made like really close up, which is good. And then you start to see how things scale from an organizational perspective. Like I've gotten to see new teams build up, new processes put in place. I've been part of uh, organizational problems. I've been part of trying to solve like uh, not just like a cross-functional team resourcing or a project resourcing, but an entire division resourcing uh, situation. You get to see how to stand up a product operations team. What do we need them for? How do we launch within like certain constraints? So I think for me that is a huge pro, is being able to understand like, now for me, for example, I am really close to understanding how um, the finances of my business work. And I like, how do you think about revenue, the bottom line, and how do you connect that back into an actual product? Because at big tech, there were moments where I felt my KPI or my KRs were so far away from the bottom line or the revenue that yes, I can make the connection, and I wanted to make the connection, and everyone should try and make the connection, but it's still hard, like especially if you end up in a backend role, like a backend team for some API in some like other part of the system that's like not directly interfacing with, like, let's say the main money making machine. And at a startup, like, I get to see that, I get to make those calculations day in day out. I'm looking at revenue numbers, converting that into churn, looking at what I'm doing right now, how am I bringing up X members, which is then impacting like churn rate by Y, which means at a average revenue per billable user, I get to see how much revenue impact that I might make. And then I can see and I can measure that completely. And I'm in it with the finance people, with the product team, which, in big tech, I would usually create a hypothesis, hand it over to an analytics person, and they would help do all the financial estimation and the forecasting and bring that back to me. But I get to see that happen. And I think you get to do that at like these kind of like startups, which for me is a very big pro of just being much more prepared as
yeah, you get to touch so much more. You get to learn so much more. You also get I guess, probably more opportunities. Like they don't have these kind of arbitrary promotion cycles. They can just promote kind of whenever they feel like. So then you're able to get promoted a lot faster. You're able to have more people under you. Like all these kind of opportunities are much easier to attain at a startup as long as you do the work.
yeah. I feel like I just want to make it clear. I don't think for anyone listening, we're not dissing big tech. I think
No. I think there's pros and cons, right?
there's pros and yeah.
Like I think the pro is obviously like you get paid well, right?
Okay, something else besides that.
You get to touch a lot more users, like literally 1 billion users on some of these products that we've been able to work on. So you get to have a lot more impact across, or maybe a shallower impact across more people. You get to work with some of the best folks in the world. I think that's maybe one of the best things. Like some of the smartest folks, like senior VPs and product people at all the companies who end up in big tech. Um, so I think there's a lot of opportunities that really kind of grow your network, meet great people that then you can then do something like Parv and I making this podcast. You can go do something with afterwards as well. So it's a good for networking. I think the people are the main thing in big tech. I think the work itself, I don't think there's too much disagreement depending on where you are. That the work is often relatively small and maybe not as fulfilling as at a startup.
I guess, sorry, and one point there, I think it also depends on your team and the level.
But yeah,
I think
100%.
sometimes we kind of, when we say PM at big tech, we make this stereotypical IC4 4.55 PM in our mind, working at one feature, like on a browser tab in a particular product. But if you scale or you move forward in someone's career path, like imagine IC 6, 7, or above that at a
Mhm.
big tech company, that is, that's a skill, or like that kind of role is insane. Like you are managing PMs, manager of PMs, you're managing like entire strategy portfolio for like multi-billion dollar
Mhm.
revenue generating platforms. And I think being able to sit in that situation and think from a product mindset and actually like scale products and have that impact, I think that, I mean, I don't think you will get that in a startup. And so
Well, I guess like to your point around the team, like the team is probably the most important thing. Like big tech has like 100,000 people in each of these companies. So every team is dramatically different. We're kind of both e-commerce PMs. So e-commerce is maybe smaller impact than like, building a satellite or something like that. So I think it really depends on where you are. And also, I guess what you kind of decide is impactful, right? Like, you know, optimizing a website so that it converts better, even if you're the VP of that, is maybe not the most fulfilling thing in the world.
I feel like
Versus
you're
like,
throwing so many fun, hot, spicy takes right
yeah,
now.
but
Not to offend
if
anyone.
you're in charge of, like satellite launches or like global internet, big tech is going to be the coolest thing to do at like the senior level, even at the smaller level, right? Because like every like feature that you build is going to have a profound impact on this whole new vertical that's growing rapidly. So yeah, to your point, it really depends on the team that you're at and kind of how interested or how much maybe you value that area. Because, you know, optimizing ad funnels, optimizing conversion rates, it is what it is. Even at the VP level, it's maybe not the most exciting. But if you're even like, IC4, IC5 at like something that you're more interested in, it's going to be a lot more fulfilling. And at big tech, obviously the impact will be much more profound, especially in product. I feel like, there's kind of this, I don't want to say it, maybe cliche is the right word, where like, you're working in big tech on this one little like, settings icon, like this one little gear icon, and like that's your whole impact. But I think as product managers, I think it's very different. Like the amount of impact, even a relatively low level like IC3, IC4 product manager at a big tech company has like a lot of impact because product managers dictate strategy at a lot of places. I mean, again, like product manager as a role is very different at all these companies. So depending on the big tech company, depending on how top down it is or bottom is up, you're going to have a different type of level of impact. But in general, a product manager has more impact than an entire team of engineers to some degree because you're defining how to make this product. You're doing the user interviews. You're trying to make sure that this is the right product to build. So, especially at bottoms up big tech, um, at those kind of companies, you essentially dictate the strategy for an entire, front end of a website, and you're able to have this profound impact, even as like someone who's relatively low level that engineers, designers, kind of other ICs and other verticals just don't have. I think that's great. It just depends on what you value. Me, like I've been saying, like I love 0 to 1. I love building stuff from scratch. So for me, it's maybe not the most exciting thing in the world. Someone else might find it enthralling. I think it really depends on your personality and what is interesting to you. Also, work life balance. I think that's also like a key part. Startups, like I was working like maybe 14 hours a day, 6 days a week at the seed stage. But I didn't feel like it. I loved everything I was doing. It was incredibly interesting. I got to do all the CAD models. I got to do all the ad buys, all the creative, all the photography. Like this is like what I love doing.
I feel like you're going to say something about the opposite in big tech. I don't think you should say it.
It depends on the company. It also depends on the team. Like that's the fundamental thing with big tech. Like if you get pulled into a team that really interests you, you're gonna have a good time and you're gonna have the impact that you're interested in. If you are in e-commerce and you're not that excited about e-commerce, then it might not be the most exciting thing in the world, and you're doing it for other reasons that aren't going to be as fulfilling, and you're going to burn out in the end.
Yeah, I think when I look back, I feel like got relatively lucky uh, in that sense because both my big tech experiences I ended up enjoying quite a lot because I got to do things at both companies that were really something that was close to my interest, and I think that's why like I still have like really fond memories from big tech PM, and I keep wondering sometimes like what it would be like to move back into big tech, um, just because I still remember like the type of problems I was solving was very different. Like I wasn't constantly not that I'm constantly fighting fires, but there is the balance of fighting fires and long-term strategic innovation. There is a different ratio in big tech versus startup.
Mhm.
And I think, in different times of your life as a PM, you value different things. And when I was at big tech, I really felt lucky and really enjoyed that part of long-term strategic planning, especially for me at that time, it was like AI and ML, spaces within e-commerce, which I think was really good, and building it, you know, at the way that we were trying to build it was really fulfilling. Uh, so to your point, I think, at the end, it's like you really know what you're looking for, trying to optimize for the things that you want to optimize for. Um, and you'll find that either place, you'll get what you want, but you need to know what you want.
Mhm.
Um,
Definitely.
and I think that's for both of us, right? That's really true. Like we did both, and I don't think either of us regret our work at either of them. Like we learned, we came out of it with so many different things. We did different things there, and now in our path, I think all of that just kind of added up. So I think you know, yeah, there are comparisons, there are things that contrast in both places. But if someone asks me like, should I work in big tech or startup, my unfortunately unhelpful answer is I think you should do both. I think you should do both. You should try both, and through that process, learn what you like and figure your own sort of like operating model and see what fits better. And be okay with it changing over time. Like I can see myself doing big tech again because I there are parts of it that I miss. But when I go to big tech, I know there'll be parts of startup that I miss. So, in that sense, it's like if I could encourage someone, I would say try both.
Yeah, it really depends on the team. Like, you hear things about all these different companies, all these different big tech companies, and like, yes, there's like a higher kind of order organizational culture, but really what is actually going to impact you is a team culture, and the team culture is dramatically different in every team. So like we have an experience in one team in one part of a massive organization, but that's not going to be everyone's experience. So yeah, as long as when you're recruiting or you're interviewing, you have a good experience with the team, the hiring manager, all those folks, and then you're actually interested in that kind of line of work, then it's going to be a lot different than if you're recruiting in a place that you're not necessarily that interested in.